straight to it as always. First up, we have texture quality. Before you start wondering why I have this setting and you don't, it's because the setting is not available after loading the game. You only have the setting available in the main menu before loading your save game. It's an important key setting though, because when we look at the average FPS, we notice no difference between the three settings. However, we do notice some textures look considerably improved, while other textures are completely different. The reason the FPS does not change here is because these textures are not more difficult to render. However, they do require more video card RAM as seen. If your VRAM is below 6 GB, then you should consider turning this setting lower. Otherwise, we recommend a setting of high for the best textures and no performance impact. Up next, we have film grain. This setting adds visual noise. It makes the game look more like a movie and helps hide some visual imperfections. There is no impact to the FPS, so if you like the effect, use it. But we're going to recommend off here because the game just looks better without it. It's more crisp and clear. Next up, we have Chromatic Aberration. This setting adds a blur and distort effect to your peripheral vision. So the sides of your screen will be blurred here like this. There is no performance impact on the FPS at all, but I will recommend off since the game looks better without it. Continuing, we have depth of field. This setting actually has no effect during normal gameplay, when you are running through the environment or driving a car. It only blurs the background and foreground during cinematic encounters like we see here. The FPS impact ranges from 0 to 2% depending on what is being rendered, and it will only affect the FPS during the cinematic scenes. It's a shame to render such a detailed game only to blur out the details. I will recommend off once again for a clearer, crisper, and sharper image. Next up is lens flare. This setting will scatter light from all light sources, making it look as if you're playing the game through a lens. For most games, we recommend leaving this on since it has no performance impact. However, in Cyberpunk, the effect is just too strong. It feels like you are wearing some very oily glasses and every single light is reflecting off them and impairing your vision. It's far more annoying than immersive. Thus, we will once again recommend turning this one off for a more clear image. Next up, we have motion blur. Realistically, you will never notice this effect unless we take the time to pause. Now you will see that the objects are blurred on medium and high as we pass by them, and clear when we set to low. There are other moments that the blur effect is implemented, but we still require a freeze frame to notice. Here, our hand and weapon are once again blurred on medium and high, and when we are struck by this kick, we notice a blur effect as we are knocked back. This is the only scenario I was able to find where the high setting creates more blur than the medium setting. We're going to recommend setting motion blur to off, mostly because a crisp and clear image looks better. Besides, we experience enough motion blur from the monitor's refresh rates. Moving on, we have contact shadows. Contact shadows affects the lighting quality only on main characters. It does not affect non-essential NPCs at all. We notice an FPS drop of 2 to 4%, which only happens when a character with these additional shadow effects is rendered. The great part is it makes the characters look a lot better and the performance drop would most of the time happen during cutscenes. So we're going to recommend setting this one to on. Next up, improved facial geometry. This is not at all what you would expect. First off, it has no effect on faces. Not on NPC faces, not on main character faces, not in the mirror, not during cinematics, not in the inventory menu, and not during character creation. So what does this setting actually do? After numerous tests, this is the only time I was able to find a difference. Rogue's jacket seems to gain a more reflective texture with it turned on. It is very odd and most likely not working as intended. There was also a 1% FPS drop, which only occurred when Rogue was in the picture. Given that Rogue's jacket looks rather poor with this turned off, we will recommend turning this on. Don't forget, I do update setting recommendations in the description, as games get fixes and updates. If you find this video helpful, don't forget to hit that sub button too when checking the description. Continuing, we have Anisotropy. This is the exact same as anisotropic filtering in any other game, and it means the distance and steepness of angle at which ground textures are rendered to full resolution. Now, in plain English, it means this is how far ground textures are fully rendered. The performance impact seems to be 3% between anisotropic 1x and 4x. Given that the visual quality beyond 4x is hard to see, the recommendation here makes the most sense at 8x, since the performance lost is negligible when compared to 4x. Next on the list, we have local shadow mesh quality. This controls the amount of objects that create shadows from global illumination. There aren't many such objects, but what's important here is that the graphics are improved at a fractional cost to our FPS. This setting will thus be a no-brainer, as we recommend the high setting. Moving on to the next one on the list, we have local shadow quality. This setting adds shadows on certain objects. The FPS drop really depends on the object being rendered. Usually the drop is 0%. But the highest FPS drop I was able to get was on main characters and reached over a 5% drop for the high setting. This one is a bit of a toss-up. The performance impact isn't huge, but the visual improvement is also not very impressive. Recommendation will be high for the better graphics, since the FPS drop is usually 0% and the 5% FPS drop only really spikes during cutscenes and indoor areas where FPS is naturally higher to begin with. Up next, Cascaded Shadow Range. This should control the distance at which cast shadows are rendered. However, all my testing showed unexpected results. Medium and high limit the distance, and low setting does not. Low also retains the highest FPS, even if just barely. I suspect this setting may not be working as intended and may be patched in a future update. If that happens, check the video description below for updates. Until then, the correct choice here will be a low setting for the best shadow quality and the highest FPS. Next, we have Cascaded Shadow Resolution, which affects the sharpness of shadows at all distances. Low looks particularly jagged and bad. Medium has a great improvement for no significant FPS drop, and high has the largest FPS drop at about 2% for a tiny improvement over medium. Recommendation will be medium for that sweet spot between performance and visual quality, as I don't think you'd notice the difference between medium and high if you weren't comparing side by side. Moving on, Distant Shadow Resolution. This makes shadows at a distance sharper and more clear. Given the FPS impact being less than 1%, makes this another easy choice. We will set this one to high. And moving on to Volumetric Fog Resolution. This is one of the two biggest performance-killing settings in Cyberpunk. This setting changes how light interacts and gives volume to fog. It's important to note that such fog is quite rare in the game, and that smoke is not affected by the setting the same way. Yet, when we look at the FPS, we notice a clear drop as we move towards Ultra. What makes this setting particularly broken is that even in scenes where this setting has no effect on visuals, it still has a large impact on our FPS, with Ultra being particularly brutal on our performance, with a performance drop ranging from 10 to 50% depending on the scene. This setting is a huge performance killer in Cyberpunk, while having no visual improvements most of the time and tiny improvements in some areas. A strong recommendation to set this on to low. Up next is Volumetric Cloud Quality. First off, this setting has no effect on smoke or fog, but unfortunately does affect performance at all times in game. What this setting adds is a shadow-like effect cast by clouds. This effect is most noticeable when it's raining, and quite frankly, the game looks a lot better without it. The FPS drop reaches 3% for Ultra. A solid recommendation for off here for improved graphics and more frames. Next on the list is Max Dynamic Decals. This setting controls the maximum amount of bullet marks left on surfaces. However, given the fact that these decals decay after 30 seconds, it is very difficult to reach the maximum amount, even on low, unless you're using a helicopter Gatling gun. Recommendation here will be the Ultra setting, since it will never have a performance impact on your frame rate. Moving on, Screen Space Reflections Quality. This is the second biggest performance destroying setting in Cyberpunk. It controls the quality of reflections on reflective surfaces. The difference is only between off and low, and there is quite a big difference. Notice the massive FPS drop as we go towards the ultra setting here. That's because when these high quality reflections are turned on, they introduce visual noise when objects overlap during motion. The higher the setting, the less visual noise that is visible. If we pause here, you can clearly see the noise I'm talking about. It's worth noting that even on Psycho, we will still notice it despite the massive FPS drop of 25% for the ultra setting. This noise is only present over reflective surfaces and doesn't always look the same. In these scenes, it's more of a trailing effect. The noise on low is really bad, and quite frankly, only becomes playable on Psycho, where performance impact becomes horrible, often reaching over 30%. When set to off, there are still reflections in the game, and there are no distracting visual noise and distortion effects. Better reflections at the cost of annoying and distracting visual noise, and at a huge cost of over 30% drop to our FPS performance. It is not worth setting this one above off. Moving down the menu, Subsurface Scattering Quality is the ability for light to penetrate the surface of a translucent object and be scattered by interacting with the material. The effect is commonly used to add realism to faces, and often adds a slight blur effect. In Cyberpunk specifically, either it is extremely subtle or it is not fully implemented yet. In either case, I was not able to notice a difference on low, medium, or high after testing many scenes. Given the 0% FPS difference, we are going to recommend high for this one, because if it does get fixed in the future, it will very likely only affect main character faces up close, which only really happens during cutscenes anyway. Moving one down, we have Ambient Occlusion. This is a shading and rendering technique used to calculate how exposed each point in a scene is to ambient lighting. When it is turned off, this light, or shadow rather, will not exist. In this scene, it doesn't make much of a difference, even though we lose over 2% FPS for each step. In this scene, it's a bit more noticeable as there are many objects that cast an ambient shadow, but it is very hard to notice the difference from low to high. In this scene, we can see the difference in how ambient shadow is rendered over here, between low and high. I struggle to really call one better than the other. We're going to recommend low here because when set to off, the shadows are completely missing, which takes away from the realism and immersion of the game. However, medium and high are not worth the additional frame rate cost, since the visual improvement is barely noticeable. Up next, color precision. You very likely won't be able to notice the difference here, because even on an IPS monitor, the difference is extremely hard to notice. It is also very likely that the difference will be lost when YouTube compresses this video. What we can easily notice is a performance drop of 5%, for a setting that you will never notice. Another solid recommendation to set this one to medium. Continuing down the list is mirror quality. This one is simple. It affects the quality of reflections in mirrors, and only mirrors. Decent quality improvement for each step, but also costs us 12% FPS for each step. However, this setting does not affect performance when not looking into a mirror. Because of this, we will recommend a setting of high here, because even though the FPS drop is high when looking into a mirror, it's also one of the few moments that high FPS isn't really needed anyway. Last on the list, we have level of detail, aka LOD. I'd like to say this controls the level of detail in the game, but it does not. I could not find any difference in detail on anything in the game. I suspect the setting is not working as intended. What is always consistent about the setting is that there is always a 1 to 3% FPS drop from low to high. Obviously, we will set this one to low to save some precious frames while losing no visual detail. If I improved your Cyberpunk 2077 experience, consider hitting that sub button. Hitting the like button also helps, but if you share this video with your friends, that would be amazing and would really help keep these videos coming. Thank you and happy gaming.